Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be doing another feed drop from Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. Today's episode will be discussing the history of haiku, one of, if not the most famous type of Japanese poetry. The famously brief poems are constrained to merely 17 total syllables, arranged in 575 format, and they often contain highly evocative natural imagery. As such, they're often sorted by the season, indicated by the nature term found in the verse. For example, mention of snow, ice, or frost will demarcate a poem as a winter poem. Mention of cherry blossoms indicates spring. Mention of cicadas indicates summer. And mention of autumn leaves indicates fall. These season words are called kigo in Japanese. Haiku is highly allusive with an A, meaning that it frequently refers to other literature and poetry, and it often relies strongly on puns, wordplay, and polysemy, or layers of different meanings. As a result, it can be pretty complicated to study. It requires high language proficiency in Japanese, a very deep knowledge of the landscape of Japanese literature in the time period from which it comes, and a solid knowledge of the historical context in which haiku arise. One of my favorite projects in graduate school was translating the previously untranslated haiku poetry of lesser-known haiku poet Kobayashi Issa, and examining them and analyzing them in terms of 18th century Pure Land Buddhism in Japan. Many don't know this, but haiku is actually part of a larger genre of literature called haikai, which includes prose, illustrations, and more, all of which we will discuss in this episode. First, we will define and discuss waka, or classical Japanese poetry as a whole. And then we will discuss the origins of haiku in the earlier genre of poetry known as renga. Then we will discuss the four great haiku poets of Japanese history and some of their poems. These will be Matsuo Basho, Yosa Buson, Kobayashi Issa, and Masaoka Shiki. Along the way, we will examine some of the themes, conventions, and modes of haiku composition, as well as those of other subgenres of haikai. So, let's get started. Waka, or classical Japanese poetry, is a word composed of two characters. Wa, meaning Japan or harmoniousness, the Japanese people, etc., and ka, meaning songs, poems, or verses. This doesn't just refer to any and all poetry ever composed by Japanese people, nor does it refer to a particular style of poetry. It's a really difficult term to get a handle on, in my opinion. It comes about in many ways as an attempt to define certain poetry against Chinese poetry, known in Japanese as kanshi. Kanshi has very specific modes and conventions, which strongly influence waka, but waka is meant to be a diversion from kanshi by being composed by Japanese people about Japanese things. In the early days of Japanese history, there isn't such a racial or cultural identity concern with the poetry as there is later in history. But waka does come to be used as a categorical descriptor to distinguish Japanese poetry that was written as kanshi versus Japanese poetry that wasn't. To reiterate, there was poetry in China. There was Chinese-style poetry in Japan. This Chinese-style poetry was called kanshi. Then there was Japanese-style poetry in Japan, called waka. As a result, waka is a larger genre which contains a large number of types, modes, and meters of verses, one of which is tanka, or short verses, which contain 5-7-5-7-7 poems. These and many other verse types in waka can be composed collaboratively, or they can be composed individually. If they're composed collaboratively, that would make them into something else called renga, which, as we've discussed, is the precursor to haiku. Renga has two characters. The first is ren, meaning group, or things strung together in a line or sequence, or also verse or stanza, and then ga, which is sometimes read as ka, meaning song, verse, or poem, as in the case of waka. The whole term together translates roughly to linked verse poetry. This is a collaborative genre of poetry including alternating stanzas, or ku, as in haiku. These alternating ku were each composed by a different person, and they would follow the 5-7-5 or 7-7 syllable rules. In Japanese, individual syllables are called mora, or sound units. For reference, the word samurai has 4 mora. Sa, mu, ra, I. The word zen has 2. Ze, n. Renga poetry claims its origins in the Kojiki, part of which we have read and discussed. There's a scene in the Kojiki where Prince Yamato Takeru, a folk hero and the son of the 12th Emperor of Japan, asks an old man how long it had been since he passed the town of Tsukuba, a city in present-day Ibaraki Prefecture. Together they trade verses back and forth to create a single sedoka, or combined verse. As such, Renga is sometimes called Tsukuba no Michi, or the practice of Tsukuba, referring to that origin point. The first textual example of Renga comes in the Manyoshu. This is an incredibly fascinating text. The title translates roughly to Collection of 10,000 Leaves, and it's one of the earliest compilations of poetry in Japanese history, originating sometime in the late 8th century Common Era. Its compilation and textual history is not super well known, but the prevailing theory is that the last compiler was Otomo no Yakamochi, one of the most revered poets in Japanese history. It contains 4,500 waka poems in 20 volumes divided into 3 genres: zoka, poems at banquets and on trips; somonka, love poems; and banka, poems to mourn the death of people. The Renga verses in the Manyoshu are the 575 opening verse, written by Otomo no Yakamochi, and the closing 7-7 verse, written by a Buddhist nun. The Sedoka, or combined verse, is a 575-7-7 verse which comes to be called Tan Renga, or short Renga. This form is the most popular version of Renga throughout the Heian period, and it would often appear in imperial anthologies of poetry. These imperial anthologies are an interesting facet of Japanese history. There are loads of them, and their purpose is to circulate acclaim and glory around the imperial throne. The court can demonstrate how cultured, artistic, and refined they are by showing off all of this wonderful poetry, and these wonderful poets, who were often very high-level nobility, could gain acclaim and status and bragging rights for being included in the imperial anthology. It was a means of bestowing favor from the emperor to people in his court. They also, of course, were for record-keeping, posterity, and for memorializing and celebrating what we now call high art. They are also sort of like displays for artistic and literary advances of Japanese poetry. Renga verses would appear in these anthologies, but they would sneak under the radar. It takes a very knowledgeable and skilled scholar to distinguish that more than one person composed a given verse that you're reading. However, the key is the link between the two verses. These links are where Renga comes alive. The meanings of the collaborated lines and verses may seem on the surface to be mutually exclusive. One verse to the next could be a total non sequitur. However, this is because later in history, there came to be specific rules about the pattern of themes and images you can use as you compose these verses, and it's because the links are the emphasis. As Tan Renga gained popularity, these links between stanzas became increasingly complex and intricate. Additionally, Renga gained popularity as a genre, and similar to flighting in Germanic and Scandinavian countries, although far less vulgar, live performances of collaborative poetry were held in the court. Poets began in the late Heian and early Kamakura periods to bend the rules and go beyond the original 2 stanzas of Tan Renga, leading to the popularization of Chō Renga, or long Renga. Instead of composing according to the 2-verse form, many poets began to compose according to the form of games like Iroha Renga, in which 47 stanzas beginning with the 47 characters of the hiragana writing system were linked. Chō Renga eventually developed into this 100-verse poem which alternated 575 and 7-7 verses, known respectively as Tanku and Choku. This became the basis for what we now know as Renga today. This genre is also referred to as Hyakuin no Renga, or 100-rhyme Renga. This isn't an episode about Renga, but I love it, and I wanted to step in here and mention that the rules about the images and motifs came to be imposed as a matter of purposefully breaking up the theme, the imagery, and the seasonality of the whole poem. By breaking these up, a 100-verse poem could then contain verses about all 4 seasons, each with varied lengths, varied images and motifs, and varied modes. In this way, they came to express a totality of sorts that reflected the Buddhist concepts of emptiness, impermanence, and dependent origination. The emptiness was found in the lack of thematic cohesion. The impermanence was found in the passing of the seasons as you read from one verse to the next. And the dependent origination was found in the special causal relationships between all of the images and motifs in the verses, and the fact that they appeared in this totality. These verses would be, again, highly allusive, with an A, meaning that they were highly referential to the Kojiki, the Nihonshoki, to other classical poetry, and to other classical literature, and they would be highly constrained in the words, images, and motifs that they could use. For example, you could mention cicadas in a summer poem, but not mosquitoes, because mosquitoes were unbecoming of high art and classical poetry. In this way, the composition of these poems required an excellent command of language, an excellent foundation of knowledge in Japanese literature, and an excellent taste and sensibility for the use of different motifs and compositional techniques. That's why Renga was thought of as being a showcase for the highest level of artistic achievement, at least from a literary standpoint, in the imperial court. Hyakuin no Renga was established as an independent genre of poetry from waka as early as the 1200s, and from then until the 1500s, it was the most popular form of Japanese poetry, at least, again, in the imperial court. However, a new genre emerged, known as haikai. Haikai is composed of 2 characters. Hai, which means performance, comedy, or something unorthodox, and kai, which means harmony, joke, or banter. The whole word refers to a less serious, less constrained, more understandable and accessible genre of literature that serves in many ways as a response to, or as a counterpart to, the serious and sometimes elite and esoteric forms of waka and renga. It's important to note that haikai is also incredibly allusive with an A, and has a dictionary of poetic words which ought to be used. So it's not to be understood as the poor man's renga, or as democratized waka. Instead, it's a funnier genre of literature that approaches topics and motifs more playfully than the very serious and emotionally evocative tones of waka and renga. Haikai, as a genre, is also a lot more varied in the actual format that it can take. We've discussed it already. There's prose literature, poetry, and illustrations. As a genre, then, it can be expressed in many different types of media, such as haiga, haikai illustrations or art accompanied by haiku poetry, and haibun, haiku mixed with prose, such as in the diaries and travel journals of haiku poets. The word haiku is thought to be a shortening of the phrase haikai no ku, which just means haikai verse or haikai poem. At this stage in history, namely the 15 and 1600s, the most famous haikai master enters the discussion. We're talking about none other than Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694. He was born Matsuo Kinsaku to a Musokunin family. Musokunin were a class of land-owning peasants granted certain privileges that would be attributed to the samurai. He was born in the city of Ueno, which then belonged to the Iga prefecture, but now is in present-day Mie prefecture. Almost nothing is known for certain about his early childhood. He is suspected to have trained in ninjutsu, as the Matsuo family was a ninja family, but this is not certain. In his late teens, Basho became a servant to Todo Yoshitada, a fairly well-to-do samurai. We don't really know what Basho's role was, but Todo loved haikai no renga, and so it's suspected that this was Basho's first exposure to it. Both Basho and Yoshitada gave themselves haigo, or haikai pen names. Basho's was Sobo, which was an alternate reading of the kanji for his adult name, Munefusa. In 1662, Matsuo Basho began writing poetry in earnest, and in 1665, Basho and Yoshitada composed their first Hyakuin no Renga with some acquaintances. In 1666, Todo Yoshitada died very suddenly, and Basho disappeared from the record for a while. It's generally believed that with the loss of Yoshitada, he gave up any possibility of being granted full samurai status, and so he left home. Contemporary biographers reference several different possible destinations, one even including to have an affair with a Shinto shrine maiden named Jutei, but that almost certainly did not happen. He was also known to have had several affairs with other men, which he sometimes references when he references his own life in writing. Nevertheless, the whole time, his poems continued to be published in anthologies that were released in 1667, 1669, and 1671. In the springtime of 1672, he moved to the capital, Edo, to join up with famous literary circles there and make a name for himself in poetry. He inserted himself into the community and was met with much acclaim for his natural and simplistic style. His verses struck the balance between being simple and accessible, and evocative, while also being highly elusive, with an A, polysemous, and well-crafted. In 1674, he was formally initiated into the haiku profession by Master Kitamura Kigin, a famous scholar and poet from the era. Later, in 1675, the founder and leader of the Danrin school of haiku came to Edo, and Basho was invited to compose with him. This master was Nishiyama Soin, perhaps the most important and famous haiku author of the time. Meeting with him and getting to compose with him was the career equivalent of getting to play soccer with Mo Salah, Leo Messi, and Cristiano Ronaldo, all on the same team as you. Composing with Nishiyama Soin gave Basho a huge boost in popularity, and after that, he gave himself the high goal of Tousei, and by 1680, he had a full time, teaching 20 disciples the art of poetry. At this point in his career, he was not composing renga nearly as much. Rather, he had begun to adapt hokku, which were the starting verses of renga, into independent poems unto themselves. In the winter of 1680 to 81, he left his highly acclaimed position in the Danrin school and moved across the Sumida River to Fukagawa, an area outside the city center of Edo. This move is often interpreted as Basho stepping toward a rustic and nomadic life. But Fukagawa is only about 5 kilometers away from the imperial palace. It's literally just across the Sumida River from the city center. He didn't move out into the mountains or deep into the untamed forest. One might say he just moved out to the burbs. His disciples built his house for him, which is further evidence that he didn't cut off his relationships or run away into the wilderness. He just wanted to live his life in a modest hut. Outside of the hut, he planted a Japanese banana tree, in Japanese known as a basho, which will become his newest and final high goal. During this time, Basho began to practice Zen meditation while simultaneously falling into a period of melancholy. In the winter of 1682, his first hut burned down, and shortly afterwards, in early 1683, his mother died. In the winter of 1683, his disciples built him a second hut in Edo, but his spirits didn't improve, and so in 1684, he left Edo to wander. Basho traveled alone on the Edo 5 routes. These are 5 routes that originate in Edo and travel to various distant regions in Japan. The first route is the Tokaido, which translates to the Eastern Sea Road, and which connects Edo to Kyoto by way of Shizuoka. The second route is the Nakasendo, which translates to the Central Mountain Road, which connected the same 2 cities but by a more northerly way. The third route is the Koshu Kaido, or the Ko Highway, which connected Edo to modern-day Yamanashi Prefecture. The fourth route is the Nikko Kaido, or the Nikko Highway, which connected Edo to the city of Nikko in modern-day Tochigi Prefecture. The fifth route is the Oshu Kaido, or the Great Northern Highway, which connected Edo to the present-day city of Shirakawa in Fukushima Prefecture. In his first 4 wanderings, he walked the Tokaido. All 5 of these roads were regarded as immensely dangerous at the time. They passed through difficult terrain in remote regions in potentially bad weather, and they were often beset by bandits. At first, Basho expected simply to die in the middle of nowhere or be killed by bandits. However, he eventually became much more comfortable on the road and began to lift out of his melancholy. Whereas before he left, his poetry was sad and introspective, now it was becoming more and more evocative of the natural scenery around him and of the experience he had on the road. He became notably more sensitive to the changing of the seasons and the weather, and to the brief encounters that he had with others on the road. He also became very aware and took to the fruits of the semi-reclusive life. He returned to Edo in 1685. He resumed teaching for the time being at his new hut in Edo, but he already intended to leave on another journey as soon as he got back. In early 1686, Basho composed perhaps his most famous haiku, Furu ikeya, kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. An ancient pond, a frog jumps in, the splash of water. He remained teaching and writing until 1689, when he finally left on the journey that would be recorded in the famous Oku no Hosomichi, or The Narrow Road to the Deep North. This title is very meaningful. The first character, Oku, means interior. In English, as we all know, this has a couple of possible meanings. It could mean the inward side, or it could mean the interior, like the deep wildlands, the interior of the forests, the interior of a country. Thus, this title is interpreted to have two meanings: narrow road to the north, but also the narrow road inward, or the journey inward into oneself. In May of that year, he left Edo with his student Kawai Soda on a journey to the northern provinces of Honshu, which would be modern-day Aomori, Iwate, and Akita prefectures. This was a massive undertaking. The northernmost road in Japan at the time only went as far as modern-day Fukushima. After Fukushima, all the way up to Aomori, the land was mostly unsettled and undeveloped, or otherwise occupied by indigenous Ainu peoples. The pair walked up to Hiraizumi, the very edge of Tokugawa governance in the north, in modern-day Iwate, about 100 kilometers north of Sendai. Then they turned westward and walked down the coastline through Niigata, Takada, Yoshizaki, Fukui, and then finally Ogaki, which is in present-day Gifu Prefecture. All along the way, Basho wrote in prose and verse in travelogue form. The trip totaled 2,400 kilometers, or 1,500 miles, and it took 150 days. In Ogaki, he edited his travelogue for 3 years, settling on a final version in 1694. After that, Basho left Edo for the last time in the summer of 1694, spending time in Ueno and Kyoto before arriving in Osaka. There, he came down with a stomach illness and passed away. The first edition of Oku no Hosomichi was published after he passed away in 1702 by his disciples, and it was an instant hit in the literary community in Edo. Many poets and fans have even walked this route as a sort of pilgrimage since the 1700s and even up to now. Many of the locations that he visited were famous locations referenced in classical Japanese literature predating Basho, but also in poetry that was produced by Basho and his contemporaries. Before we move on, let's read 3 of Basho's most famous poems. We've already read the frog one, which is his most famous, and here are 3 more. Ara umiya, Sado ni yokotao, Amanogawa. The rough sea, stretching out towards Sado, the Milky Way. This one was written on the southern leg of the journey, when he was walking towards Sado Island off the west coast of Japan. Toshi kurenu, kasakite waraji, haki nagara. Another year is gone, a traveler's shade on my head, straw sandals at my feet. This one was written in 1685, when he was still wandering on the Tokaido. Basho uete, mazu nikumu ogi no futaba kana. By my new banana plant, the first sign of something I loathe, a miscanthus bud. This one was written in 1680 after his disciples built him his first hut in Fukagawa, and he planted his banana tree and took on the high goal of Matsuo Basho. Next, let's discuss the second of the four great haiku masters, Yosa Buson. Much less is known of Buson than of Matsuo Basho. We don't even know his birth name, if he even had one. Nevertheless, he still has a very interesting story. Buson was born in the village of Kema in Setsu Province, or modern-day Osaka, in 1716, 23 years after the death of Matsuo Basho and 15 years after the publication of Oku no Hosomichi. His family's original name was Taniguchi, and Yosa was an adopted last name. Like Matsuo Basho, hardly anything is known about his childhood, and there are several different theories about his parentage. One theory is that he was the illegitimate son of the village head and a migrant worker from Yosa. According to the Taniguchi family in Yosano, a neighborhood of the Yosa district in Kyoto, Buson was the son of a servant woman named Gen, who had come to work in Osaka and had a child with her master. Gen's purported grave in Yosa is still maintained to this day. Another theory is that the young Buson had been cared for at the Seiyakuji Temple in Yosano, in Kyoto. As you can see, he likely took on the name of Yosa as a reference to where he was born, or at least where his mother was born. Sometimes he's also called Yosa no Buson, where no is kind of like de or da or di in Latin languages, or van in Germanic languages, meaning from a place. Leonardo da Vinci's last name isn't da Vinci. His name means Leonardo from the town of Vinci. Yosa no Buson is Buson from Yosa. Despite his potentially being an illegitimate child, he was still fairly affluent, and he received an elite education from the wealthy Taniguchi family. At the age of 20, Yosa pops up in Edo as the student of Haikai master Hayano Hajin, who had a Haikai school called the Yahantei, or the Midnight Pavilion. During this time as a student of Hayano, Yosa would have undoubtedly encountered Matsuo Basho because his Oku no Hosomichi, and by extension his other works, were still the gold standard of Haikai literature at the time. We have reason to believe that Yosa took to Basho's work and even idolized him, because when Hayano died in 1742, Yosa pops back up in Shimosa province, present-day Ibaraki prefecture, and we see that he was planning on following Basho's footsteps into the deep north. He did just this, and he wandered the wilds of the northern provinces, and published his writings from the trip in 1744 under the name Buson for the first time. He didn't quite follow Basho's path perfectly, but he did visit many of the same places that Basho visited. During this time, he also studied painting and tried to make it as a Haiga painter. He likely struggled because he couldn't get connected to a master painter, so his name carried no weight on its own. After publishing his travelogue at the age of 42 in 1758, Buson settled in Kyoto. This was an interesting choice on his part, and I'd like to step back and discuss why. Let me begin by saying there is a reason that it's called the Edo period, and not the Kyoto period, not the Osaka period, not the Niigata period. During the reign of the Tokugawa shogunate, from 1600 to 1868, their capital city of Edo was the center of print culture, of literary culture, of visual arts culture, of fashion culture, of theater culture, etc. That's not to say that there weren't artists and poets and writers from anywhere else in Japan. There were some wonderful ukiyo-e prints, some wonderful textiles, and some wonderful theatrical works that came from all over, and more coming from Kyoto and Osaka and other big cities. But it's like the difference between Atlanta and New York City, or Marseille and Paris, or Birmingham and London. If you're a budding artist with grand aspirations, you know which one you want to move to. You know which one has the most upward potential when it comes to fame and acclaim. Edo was, in many ways, like the New York City of Japan at the time, and so it was an interesting career choice to move to Kyoto as an advanced poet and intermediate beginner painter. I have my speculations as to why he did this. Obviously, he might have had a connection there, due to his mother being from there, but there's more than just that. Ueda Makoto, a renowned scholar of haiku and haiku poets, mentioned that Buson had connections through his teacher Hayano. Hayano's students had moved to Kyoto, so it's likely that Buson relied on them when he moved. My speculation is that although Edo was like the New York City of Japan, it was still kind of new and emerging, and Kyoto had this older appeal to it. Kyoto was the old capital, from 794 until 1868, almost 1100 years. It was still the second largest city in Japan, and it had this classical, artistic, and literary appeal to it. It would be like deciding you don't want to move to a big modern city like New York City, and instead you want to move somewhere with an old world appeal, with more history, and with more prestige, like Rome. During this time, he continued to perfect his painting craft by studying painting at a Buddhist temple called Kenjoji, and he published a collection of yokai emaki called the Buson Yokai Emaki. Emaki is a picture scroll, and yokai are mythical creatures, demons, and spirits in Japanese folklore, which we've done an episode on. These scrolls are incredible because they're done in this Haiga style, and they're interspersed with Haibun literature. It's thought that he had this interest in demons and spirits and ghosts, and so while he studied in Edo, while he wandered the north, and while he traveled all over Kyoto and parts of Shikoku, he collected various stories and names of yokai from the locals, and he put them all into this collection of emaki. When we say they're printed in the Haiga style, it means that the illustrations are very simple, usually just black ink on white paper, with simple lines and no coloring, and very little shading. But they purposefully reject all semblance of realism and look for playful approaches to visually depicting characters. Buson's work was one of the first to bring this approach to yokai. Prior to the Edo period, yokai were often depicted as supernatural, as foreign, and as horrifying creatures that brought chaos and danger, much like demons in Christian imagery. However, in the Edo period, they came to be represented as funny little creatures who were more entertaining than scary. Consider the soot sprites from the movie My Neighbor Totoro, as opposed to perhaps Paimon from the movie Hereditary. There were 8 yokai depicted in the Buson Yokai Emaki. One was the famous Bakeneko, or the changed cat, or the ghost cat, which is one of my favorite yokai. Cats have a special supernatural status in Japanese folklore. They're seen as being mischievous, smarter than they let on, and tapped into knowledge of the beyond that we aren't tapped into. This has a lot to do with their appearance and behavior. Their eyes change shape with the light, which can be strange or alien to us. Sometimes touching cats causes sparks because of the buildup of static charge. And sometimes they were known for disappearing for long periods of time and then coming back like nothing ever happened. In pre-modern Japan, cats even sometimes used to drink lamp oil, which seems wild to us now, but it was probably because they often used crude fish oils for lamp fuel back then. Other yokai in the scrolls include the Napperabo, or the faceless monk, the Ubume, or the ghost of a woman who died in childbirth, the Yonaki Baba, a witch, and various fruit monsters, like a watermelon monster. While in Kyoto, he also started a family. He married at 45 and had a daughter named Kuno. From this time, he traveled around and worked on many paintings, many poems, and much Haibun literature. Later in life, in 1770, he took on the high goal of his master, naming himself Yahante II, and he began teaching poetry in the Sumiya, a famous recreational palace complex in the former red light district of Shimabara in Kyoto. In 1784, at the age of 68, he passed away. The cause of death was originally diagnosed as severe diarrhea, but more recent investigations actually indicate that it was probably a myocardial infarction. In his life, Buson found most of his success with painting, even though he never really connected with a master painter or illustrator who could help him establish himself. He was successful with his poetry as well, but he never approached it the same way that he did his painting. He played with poetry, but he was serious about Haiga and painting. I don't want to discount the effort he put into studying and honing his poetry skills, but he had a self-proclaimed playful approach to it, as many Haikai figures did, and he even acknowledged that he thought that Haikai should not be constrained by strict rules, and that it should be natural and playful. He often also mixed Chinese and Japanese style poetry in his verses. He often broke the syllable count rules, and he often wrote about quote-unquote low art topics, such as occult and macabre stuff, instead of high art topics like cherry blossoms and snow. Let's read some of these poems. All of these I'm about to present are undateable, but they're written under his name. Tamamizu ni utarete. Komoru katatsuburi. Meditating in the dripping rain. A snail. This one is evocative of a Shinto priest meditating under a waterfall. The snail also moves very slowly, and the water is dripping fast, striking a contrast between these two elements. Tsurigane ni tomarite, nemuru kocho kana. Temple bell, perched on it and asleep, a butterfly. This one contains a lot of contrast and tension. The bell is hard, solid, large, loud, cold, heavy, inanimate, and the butterfly is soft, small, light, and alive. Also, the bell could ring at any moment and startle the butterfly. Oyogu toki, yorube naki-sama no kawazu kana. When it swims, how forlorn the figure, a frog. This one seems to be a reference to Basho's famous frog poem from earlier, but with a different approach. This one is a sadder, quieter look at the frog, speaking not of the sound it makes, but of the silent, forlorn figure it takes while it swims. The third of the four great masters is my favorite, Kobayashi Issa. I've written a 30-page research project on him and his poetry, with some original translations that I did of his haiku poems, and I adapted that research project into an episode of my other show, Bright on Buddhism. For the sake of not repeating myself, I'll just go ahead and link to that episode in the show notes. If you'd like to listen to it, check it out there. Let's move on to the fourth great master, Masaoka Shiki. Masaoka Shiki is fascinating, as he's one of the great haiku masters, but he was not actually alive during the Edo period when haiku poetry was at its most popular. He was born Masaoka Tsunenori in 1867 in Matsuyama, Ehime, to a modest samurai family. For some reason, he had several different names throughout his life. As a child, he was called Tokoro Nosuke. In adolescence, his name was changed to Noboru. In adulthood, he went by his high goal, Shiki. His father, Tsunenao, was an alcoholic who died when he was 5, and his mother Yae was the daughter of Ohara Kanzan, a well-known Confucian scholar. Kanzan tutored Shiki, and by age 7 he was reading Mencius. However, he didn't really like school, and he often thought of himself as a poor student. He was very politically active, even for a youth, and he was known to have had an affiliation with the Jiyu Minken Undo, or the Freedom and People's Rights Movement, as early as age 15. This group was a super pro-democracy political organization that fought in favor of having an elected government, civil rights statutes, revised foreign policy, and a centralized taxation system. This eventually did work out for the most part, except for the tax part, and in 1889, the Meiji government ratified a constitution and a national diet a year later. In 1883, at age 15 or 16, Masaoka Shiki moved to Tokyo under an arrangement with his maternal uncle and continued his schooling there. Masaoka Shiki studied for about a year at Kyoritsu Middle School, and later matriculated into University Preparatory School, or Daigaku Yobimon, which fed students to Tokyo Imperial University, or Teikoku Daigaku. While studying here, the teenage Masaoka Shiki picked up baseball, which was just starting to become all the rage in Japan, and even befriended fellow student Natsume Souseki, who would go on to become an incredibly famous novelist. Natsume is best known for his novels Kokoro, Botchan, I Am a Cat, Kusamakura, and his unfinished work, Light and Darkness. Masaoka Shiki entered Tokyo Imperial University in 1890, but by 1892 he dropped out because he had become too engrossed in haiku writing. He had begun to fail his examinations and not be able to succeed in his courses, so he left the university to pursue haiku writing full-time. There's also a chance that at this time he was infected with tuberculosis, which would crop up again and again throughout the rest of his life, and that was what caused him to drop out and begin writing full-time. In 1888 or 1889, he began showing symptoms, specifically coughing up blood, and he soon adopted the Haiku or pen name of Shiki. This name has many layers of meaning. The characters of the name could be read as Hototo Gisu, the Japanese name for lesser cuckoos. It's a Japanese figure of speech that this bird coughs up blood as it sings, hence the pen name Shiki, as a symptom of tuberculosis is coughing up blood. Shiki could also be a word play on his other name, Tsunenori. The kanji nori from Tsunenori and ki from Shiki are the exact same, and shi from Shiki means child, and the whole word Shiki means cuckoo, so the pen name could be a play on words based on his real name, the child cuckoo Tsunenori, or child Tsunenori, or something like that. As we've discussed elsewhere on the show, the Meiji Restoration was a time of lightning-quick modernization and westernization for Japan, without going into too much detail about what westernization and modernization actually mean. As a result, a lot of Edo period culture, such as haiku writing, was losing popularity and prevalence during the life of Masaoka Shiki. He was getting into it a little too late. However, it wasn't completely gone, and Shiki wanted to bring it back, reform it, modernize it, or otherwise overhaul the genre in order to preserve it as a valid literary outlet suited to the hustle and bustle of the modern Meiji world. In 1892, he dropped out of Tokyo Imperial University. He published a serialized work advocating haiku reform called Dasai Shoku Haiwa, or Talks on Haiku from the Otter's Den, in the newspaper Nippon, which soon after offered him a job as a haiku editor. Shiki would go on to publish several serialized works, several haiku, and other works of literary criticism with Nippon for many years. He published a haiku beginner's guide called Haiku Taiyo, and he later published the Meiji Nijukunen no Haiku Kai, or the Haiku World of 1896, where he praised works by poets Takahama Kyoshi and Kawahigashi Hekigoto. Still suffering from the early symptoms of tuberculosis, Shiki sought work as a war correspondent in the First Sino-Japanese War. But he got unlucky, and he arrived in China after the April 17, 1895 signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki that ended the war. Still, he remained in China, and instead of reporting on the war, he mainly just lived in very subpar conditions, got bullied by a bunch of Japanese soldiers, and continued writing. Also, while living there, Shiki's tuberculosis symptoms worsened the longer he stayed in China, and so after he returned to Japan, he had to be hospitalized in Kobe. After being discharged, he returned to his hometown of Matsuyama City and convalesced at Natsume Soseki's house. During this time, he started somewhat of a haiku school in the Edo period guild style that emphasized gaining inspiration from personal experiences of nature. Still in Matsuyama in 1897, a member of this group, Yanagihara Kyokudo, established a haiku magazine called Hototogisu, in allusion to Shiki's pen name, where haiku verses were published. This magazine quickly took off in the literary world, and operation of it soon moved to Tokyo. Takahama Kyoshi, one of Shiki's disciples, assumed control of the magazine, and the magazine's scope was soon expanded to include prose work and other literature in addition to haiku as well. Shiki also returned to Tokyo to be near to his other disciples, and this group came to be known as the Nippon School, after the newspaper where Shiki had been a haiku editor, and that now published the group's work. By 1897, however, Shiki became totally bedridden with tuberculosis, and in 1901, he developed what's called Pott's disease, which is where the tuberculosis bacteria infects the spine and causes severe arthritis. He then passed away due to complications of tuberculosis and Pott's disease in 1902 at the very young age of 34. Now, let's read some of his haiku poetry. Tori nakuya, kofuji no fumoto, momo no hana. A cock crows at the foot of the small Mount Fuji peach blossoms. This one is perhaps his most well-known haiku, and it's a fascinating one because it exemplifies Shiki's whole approach. It's evocative of a simple natural scene, but it bucks at conventions. The most common springtime motif in haiku by far is cherry blossoms, and instead of treading over well-trodden ground by mentioning Mount Fuji and cherry blossoms like everybody and their mother, he chooses peach blossoms instead. Similarly, he chooses the rooster, which rarely features in haiku, but which is, by his lifetime, an increasingly important and prevalent animal in Japanese farming. Finally, he mentions Fuji, but specifically, he mentions a small Mount Fuji, likely referring to a burial mound or a replica of Mount Fuji. Uchi no choma ga tonari no tama o matsu yoru kana. My cat Choma, waiting for the neighbor's cat Tama at night. This one is fun because it's a cat love story, but it also breaks the syllable rules. Instead of being 575, this one is 676. This is exemplary of Shiki's deliberately loose approach to the formal rules of haiku. Haru fukaku, kusari shi mikan, konomi keri. Full of spring, rotten oranges. How sweet. This haiku is very sarcastic and irreverent in its view of the beauties of spring, expressing doubt about the usual awestruck imagination of nature that comes up in haiku. By applying this funny, tongue-in-cheek approach, he creates an evocative haiku that, while following all the compositional conventions to the letter, bucks at tonal and thematic tropes of the genre. Now that we've discussed the four great masters, I wanted to briefly go over some important haiku conventions. These will be general rules that are followed for the most part when composing haiku poetry. There's more than just the syllable constraint to consider. In the West, we typically think of the 575 rule as the number one rule of haiku, but actually, that one is perhaps one of the least important rules. It's very often broken by haiku poets, sometimes by two whole syllables. In addition to the syllable rules, there are some vocabulary, content, and theme conventions that we should talk about. The first of these is the kireji. The word kireji means cutting word, and it refers to one or two syllables added on to the end of a line of a haiku poem which serves various purposes. There's no equivalent of kireji in English, so we will have to do a short Japanese language lesson to understand them. Japanese doesn't have directional articles or prepositions in the same way that English does. Most of these grammatical functions are served by what we call particles, or joshi. These words serve the function that the English words to, from, at, with, also, and others serve. There are 8 types of particles: case markers, parallel markers, sentence ending, interjectory, adverbial, binding, conjunctive, and phrasal. Most of these have a more or less direct English translation, if not a corresponding word. In the sentence, I went to the store. To is a preposition that indicates direction. The equivalent Japanese sentence would be mise ni ikimashita. Ikimashita is the verb to go in the past tense, and mise is store or shop. Ni is the case marking particle that indicates direction. Some particles don't have an English equivalent. For example, interjectory particles such as sa, yo, and ne indicate assertion, emphasis, and confirmation seeking, respectively. In English, we would use tone of voice to indicate assertion, or an exclamation point to indicate emphasis in writing, or maybe a word plus punctuation, such as right with a question mark, to indicate confirmation seeking. Kireji are a type of classical Japanese particle that are adapted for use in poetry. They're not as easy to distinguish as modern particles, but they serve similar functions. They can indicate emphasis, wondering, rhetorical questioning, and more. Some common ones used in haiku are ka, kana, keri, ya, shi, and tsu. Depending on which kireji is used and its position within the verse, it may briefly cut the stream of thought, suggesting a parallel in theme or content between the preceding and following phrases. Or it may provide a stronger ending, concluding the verse with a heightened sense of closure. Most cutting words come after the 7-syllable line, the middle line in haiku, but some come at the end of the first 5-syllable line. In Basho's Old Frog Pond haiku, Furu ikeya, kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto, the cutting word comes at the beginning of the first line, and it is ya, emphasizing the previous word, furu ike. The first line here is just an image of a stationary landmark. It sets the scene. It's like in a screenplay where it says, exterior, old pond. This is an image of stillness, dormancy, and quietude. Then the lines after read, kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. A frog jumps in, the splash of water. These lines indicate motion, sound, and life. Thus, you can see the change from before and after the cutting word ya. The next convention I would like to discuss is the kigo, or the season word. Haiku verses are typically defined by the time of year, indicated by the images or motifs used in the verse. Just like Hyakuin no Renga had very specific rules and patterns surrounding the use of seasonal images like cherry blossoms, snow, autumn leaves, etc., each haiku typically has a season word that categorizes it as a spring poem, summer poem, a winter poem, or a fall poem. It can even get more specific than that. There can be early and late winter poems, there can be New Year's poems, and there can be other kinds of poems as well. The New Year's poems would typically be composed at a New Year's celebration, and the early and late winter poems are dependent upon what ecosystem you are in Japan. For example, the imagery in the poem will change if it's an early winter poem if you're in Hokkaido versus if you're in Hiroshima. There's so much natural variety and climatic variety in Japan that it can often make a difference whenever you're analyzing the poetry as to what period of a season you're looking at. In the distant south of Japan, an early spring poem may still have cherry blossoms. If you're in the very, very far north of Japan, a late winter or even early spring poem will still have snow. As such, the kigo were usually natural images that were visible or relevant to the time or season with which they're associated. In the springtime, sakura blooms throughout Japan. In winter, it snows. In fall, the leaves turn colors. Thus, sakura, snow, and autumn leaves are all season words. As resources for haiku poets, and for renku and renga composers as well, there are even dictionaries of season words that are paired with calendars or almanacs that explain which season phase you're in based on where you are and what the date is, and then what season words go with that time and place. Many poets would use these resources in the composition, but scholars also use these resources in the study and analysis of haiku as well. I think that this is another incredibly loose and not strict convention in haiku poetry. Many of the great poets we've discussed have specifically played with or even rejected the kigo convention. They have either used unconventional kigo to indicate seasons, such as not using sakura to indicate spring, or they've composed poems without any season words at all. Nevertheless, it's a convention that exists out there. Here are some common season words, or kigo, first in Japanese and then in English. For winter, fuyu, winter. Tsuru, crane. Kareha, dry leaves. For spring, haru, spring. Sakura, cherry blossoms. Kawazu, frogs. For summer, natsu, summer. Ka, mosquito. Himawari, sunflower. For autumn, aki, autumn. Momiji, autumn maple leaves that have turned red. Tsuki, moon. As you can see, many of these are common seasonal motifs all across the northern hemisphere. Not mentioned, but still common, are weather words: cold, snow, and ice for winter; chill, wind, and changed leaves for fall; hot, humid, and brightly sunny for summer; warm, misty, and rainy for spring. These will indicate to the reader which season it was when the poet viewed the thing they mention, and this serves to pull the reader into the experience indicated by the verse. Imagery is a critical part of drawing in readers to a scene or experience in which you are trying to evoke some sort of feeling or tone. Now, let's wrap up with some takeaways. One thing I'd like to start with is that many of the poets we've talked about experienced a great deal of tragedy and loss in their lives, and were wanderers for long periods of time. This isn't universal, but it's common enough to evoke an image of a suffering artist, similar to the impoverished and alcoholic writer trope in the West. This image is cultivated to a certain extent. It evokes sympathy with the authors, and it serves as something of an emotional buy-in for the reader. It makes us think that they will be tapped into a feeling or an experience in a way that everyday people wouldn't be, because they haven't experienced the depths of tragedy and suffering. The image of the author looms over the verses, in the case of haiku. There are tons of examples in world literature where that is definitely the case, but also where it's definitely not the case. It can be the case in other genres of literature from other places in the world and other times that the author's life and experience can provide context, or can provide an analytical lens through which to understand why they wrote what they wrote and why they did it the way they did. The author can sit in the back seat while the written work does its thing, or not. In haiku poetry, the author never sits in the back seat. The author and their lives, experiences, and image all figure into the verse as you would read it and as you engage with it. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is that the verses themselves are very short and simple. So, it's the author's knowledge and past experiences, the allusions with an A, and references that they're making, and the experience they're narrating, such as seeing something in nature or feeling something while doing something, that are all at the core of the poem's impact. The other reason is that historically, haiku poetry, like many other art forms at the time, was organized into something analogous to a guild structure in the Edo period and beyond. In other words, somebody who independently earned a claim as a poet would then turn around and start a school, where disciples would come and learn from them. Then, in the public eye, knowledge of who a poet trained with, what school they were a part of, afforded weight, credibility, and recognition to the literary community. If you saw my book on the shelf and saw that I was trained in how to write by Stephen King, you'd be more likely to buy my book because of the association with one of the greats in novel writing. That association simultaneously brings about expectations about content and theme, both now and in the Edo period in Japan. Seeing that I had an affiliation with Stephen King, you'd think that my book was probably a horror novel. Similarly, in Japan in the Edo period, different schools of haiku poetry were expected to have particular themes, conventions, methods, and styles in their writing. It was by means of those thematic, methodological, and stylistic differences that different schools defined and distinguished themselves in the literary community. Then, it was by means of these affiliations that relationships among writers were defined. This school is on good terms with that school, but they have a rivalry with this other one. The politics of this guild-like structure define the context and backdrop for the composition of haiku poetry. These schools are also curated and protected their literary resources for their school members very closely. They kept and studied everything from haiku dictionaries and kigo dictionaries to waka compilations and classical Japanese literature compilations. They also kept contemporary literary publications from haiku poets in the scene. Thus, these guilds maintained the literary knowledge base behind the practice of allusion with an A and reference to older literature. But also, they were in dialogue with contemporary literature and other composers from other schools. So when you read a verse, you are reading one entry in a literary conversation between potentially dozens, if not hundreds of people that has been ongoing for potentially centuries long. And it's referencing material and events that took place anywhere from a few days ago to a few millennia in the past. That's what makes it so hard to study haiku. So much of the meaning, significance, and context for what you're reading is lost on us because of the passage of time, difference of culture and context, and the lack of knowledge of the environment and the ecosystem in which these poems arise. As a result of this complicated poetic ecosystem, haiku is far more varied than Westerners typically think. It's common for Westerners to reduce haiku to its constrained 5-7-5 structure and to some images and motifs of nature, such as cherry blossoms or whatever. When we reduce it to that, we also tend to fill it back in with stuff that's entirely untrue, or is otherwise colored by stereotypes about Japan. We say things like, haiku are very centered on Zen philosophy, or Japanese people are more emotionally attuned and sensitive to nature, etc. These things are untrue, as in the case of the Zen philosophy thing, or they're racist, as in the case of the thing about Japanese people being sensitive to nature. Even though it's a positive stereotype and may be a nice thing to say, it's still racist to make statements about all Japanese people together like that. I hope I've shown here that there is far more to haiku poetry than what you may have thought before. I hope you enjoyed this not in any way at all comprehensive history of haiku. Thanks for listening to this feed drop from Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast on Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.